Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Right. Before we start the lectures, just let you know that the information about the second assignment is on Wattle already. Some of you might have aware of that. So we will talk about the assignments during the tutorial class. Okay, so your tutors will explain the assignments to you during the tutorial class. Okay. And for the groups, there will be 3 in a group, and I have set up a group registrations, so you can register your group via Wattle website. Okay, and if you need to find your group members, there is a discussion forum just for finding group members, so you can make use of that. Okay, all right. So and I will leave the assignment for the time being. So we'll talk more about that during tutorial. Okay, all right. So today's we'll look at 2 topics. The first one is the cultural and public heritage assets. So this is a continuation from last week's topic. We look at accounting for assets specifics to the public sector. So last week we looked at infrastructure, facilities, and so today we look at cultural and public heritage assets. So the second topic is the marketizations of public sector services. Okay. So the first hour we will look at the cultural and public heritage facilities. Right. So for this topic, the first readings is continuing from last week, right? So chapter 8, pages 314 to 347, okay? And the second articles look at the accounting issues for public heritage facilities, and it try to discuss whether public heritage facilities should be recognized as assets in the public sector financial statements or not. And the third article it is a survey, and you look at whether the accounting standard requirement in relation to heritage assets is useful to meet users' information needs or not. Right? It's an Italian studies, but again, the concept is also relevant to Australia or worldwide. Okay. There are other articles which basically discuss and argue about the accounting for these types of facilities because it is quite controversial. Mm-hmm. So first of all, we'll look at the concepts of cultural and public heritage assets or facilities, right? Whether it should be recognized as assets or not, and some of the valuation issues involved. Apart from the valuations of financial information, is there any other information that might be useful, right, for the management of these types of facilities, right? And finally, there is an alternative views about accounting for these types of facilities. Okay. All right. So before we start, do you know any heritage facility? Maybe in Australia. Show you some pictures. Right, you might be recognize some of them, so you might already been there before. Right, so Port Arthur, right, this is a historical site, so it's one of the heritage facilities in Australia. This you will be familiar with, right? So I guess most of you have been there. The Opera House. So this one, right, looks beautiful, right? It's Lord Howe Island, right? So yeah, again. Yeah, it's a heritage site. Uluru, right? Have you been there? Right, so a very controversial place, but yeah, it's beautiful and also it's a heritage site as well. Right, this one. It's beautiful, is it? It's the Great Barrier Reef. Against, have you been there? Yeah, so if you have a chance, go there, have a look. Right, so it's quite interesting as well. All right, so this is in Canberra here, Calvert House, right? So it's a historical house listed as heritage, right? So again, it's quite interesting. So we have a chance. It's just in Canberra, so you can have a look at that. This one you'll be familiar with, right? The High Court, Australia, again, in Canberra. So yeah, you can easily go there, have a look. All right. So and there are others Australia's World Heritage List, right? So this is not inclusive, but get this from Department of Finance website. Okay, so you can see some of the convict site, right? So this Port Arthur historical site is the pictures that we look at just now, and many of the rainforests, right, in Australia, there are also some heritage. And some of these areas, we look at that already, right? Great Barrier Reef, Blue Mountains, right? So we're familiar with. Kakadu National Park, some of the area, okay? So just give you some ideas about the heritage facilities in Australia. And so give you some ideas. Okay, so what are the characteristics of these types of facilities? Right, they're quite beautiful, right? And would you like to go there? Have a look. I guess most of the people, they would like to go there and have a look. So the key characteristics, right, is physical assets. They are physical assets, right? And it is for the communities, and the government maintain and preserve them, right, in perpetuities, right, for social and community purposes, and not for commercial purposes, right, because they have significant cultural and environmental and historical values, okay. And some of the characteristics here, they are not to be sold, right, so many of them, they do not have an active market, so normally they're not for sales, right, but they are for community purpose, social and community purposes. And they provide and managed by government, right, and open to the public, and so they serve a social functions, right, rather than commercial functions. And normally most of the areas have free entries, right, because they are funded by government, right, they're funded from taxation revenues. And some may have a nominal charges or ask you to provide some donations, etc. Right, they're mainly for cost recovery purpose only. Okay, but they're very small amount, right? So the main purpose is still open to the public for enjoyment, right, for entertainment. And so the benefit flows to the public and not to the governments, right? Because they're open for public enjoyment. So. And they provide some significant cultural, historical values, okay? And so they have social benefits, right? And it also have the nature of public goods, and talk more about that later. And cultural and public heritage facilities can include both natural capital and man-made facilities. Natural capitals such as the one we look at just now, like the Great Barrier Reef, right? They're natural capital, or rainforest, okay? Lohau Island, those areas, Blue Mountains, right? So they are natural capitals. And man-made facilities mainly refers to such as paintings, right? Or those in the war memorial, right? Military equipments, etc. Or the rare architectural artifacts, etc. Okay. All right. So the Australian Heritage Council, right, is one of the Australian government council. It compile and maintain a registers of the national estate, right, and have more than 12,000 places, right, of national significance. And even in ACT, there are more than, I think, 250 registers already, right? So it's quite significant. And the Australian Heritage Council is also provide advice, right, to government in relation to the preservation, conservation of the heritage facilities and all these national estate. So. The public heritage facilities can be considered as public goods, right? because they have that kind of characteristics, such as non-rival, right? So all these facilities, they are non-rival, non-excludable nature. And so if you go to the park, right, go to Great Barrier Reef or go to any of these historical sites, right, so you can't exclude other people to go there, right, so they're non-excludable. And there's an absence of users' property rights, right, so in that case, it means it's not really feasible to charge a fees, right, unless they restrict access to people, right. Some area, they normally, as I say, they just ask for some donation. Okay. They have externalities, right, including social costs and benefits. And in heritage facilities, many of them actually have social benefits, right, because they provide entertainment or social life, right, and enhance the community knowledge. So they have social benefits. Okay. Right. Okay. So if they are significant, should they be recognized as assets, right, in the government financial statements? Now, this is a very controversial issue, and so far, and even now, there is not really a certain answer to it, right? It's still very debatable. So the Australian accounting standards, right, require public heritage facilities to be recognized as assets, right, in the statement of financial positions or the balance sheet. Okay, so if we base on the AASB framework definitions of assets, right, so there are two main characteristics of assets, right? So one is generations of future economic flows, future economic benefits that flows to the entity, right, and also controlled by entities. So if you look at economic benefits, so what does economic benefits mean? So the conceptual framework interpret that as generations of cash flow, right? So the cash flow will be generated to provide a value in use or value in exchange. So you may heard about these concepts. So what is value in use and what is value in exchange, right? So for public heritage facilities, they normally have very little value in use because these assets are not really used to generate revenue, right, for the entities. Okay, so they're not used to generate revenues. So they have very little value in use in terms of cash generations. And also some have very little value in exchange because they're not for sale. Okay, yeah. And it can be argued that they actually provide social benefits, right, rather than financial benefits. Right. So the use of the term like economic benefits does not seem to fit very well into this kind of facilities. Right. So if it can be interpreted as providing social benefits, then it might fit into the definitions. Okay. So how about the control elements? Okay. We look at control and also the nature of ownership property rights. Right. So if we look at the rights. There are three concepts discussed in the literature. The first one is right to manage. So does the government have the right to manage? Probably yes. Okay. So the government manage the heritage facilities and maintain the heritage facilities, so they have the rights to manage. So does the government have rights to benefits? Right. So does the benefit flow to the entities? So probably it's not, right, because the benefits largely flow to the community, flow to the users of this kind of facilities, right, rather than the entity itself. Okay, and does the government have the right to dispose of assets? It depends, right? It depends on the power of the government agency, right? And sometimes the government entity, they may have certain power to dispose it, but for significant assets, they might need the approval from the ministers to dispose the assets. So that means sometimes the government entity may not have the right to dispose because they require approval to do that. Okay, so the control elements is arguable whether it is as defined in the conceptual framework, right? It's arguable whether they are really applicable to the public sector, okay, and specifically to these types of facilities. Okay, so now let's look at the financial positions, concepts of financial positions. Okay, if you would recognize the assets, right, the public heritage facilities in the financial position, what does that mean, right? So if you look at a private firm, in a private firm, the financial statements indicate the amount of assets possessed by the firm, right, for their operation. So they use the assets to generate some revenues. They use the assets to continue their operation. So it's an indications of their operations capacity, right, to continue their operations. And so they are being invested, right, as a productive resources. And it also indicates the firm's abilities to repay debts, right? But for government, heritage facilities probably can't be used to repay the debt, right? Okay, because they're not for sales, right? So so if you put it in the balance sheet, it doesn't indicate the solvencies of the government. It doesn't indicate that these assets can later on be used, right, to be sold in order to pay the liability and debt, right? So it doesn't work that way. Okay, so considering all these concepts, can public heritage facility be classified as assets? Right, so it's arguable, right, based on all these arguments. And Barton's article say no, right, they shouldn't be recognized as assets. And some other articles, they talk about whether is it really a liability actually, because apart from not generating cash flow, in fact, it involves cash outflow, right, to maintain the assets. So maybe it's a liability. So there are different arguments, right, in relation to these types of facilities. Okay. So the next question is, is it satisfy recognition criteria? So even though we say okay, so you, it may be an asset, right? But does it satisfy recognition criteria? Right. We already look at future economic benefits. Okay, so it doesn't really fit in. And how about the reliability measurement? Right. So assets has to be able to be measured reliably, right, in order to be recognized in the financial statement. Okay, so what is the problems in valuing cultural and public heritage facilities? Now, last week we already looked at some of the issue in valuing infrastructure facility, and these types of facility is even more difficult, right, in terms of valuations. So if we look at natural capital heritage assets, the natural capital, like think about the Great Barrier Reef, right, or rainforest, etc. Well, how do you put a value onto it? Okay, and most of these natural capital, they do not have production cost. Okay, so it's hard to put a value onto it. So historical cost is not relevant because there's no production cost, no acquisition cost, and there is no markets for them. So yeah, so how can you get the market price or replacement values, etc. Right? So it's quite difficult. Now, how about the man-made heritage facilities? Some argue that yes, we may be able to find some market, right, for the man-made heritage facilities, right, such as paintings. Right? So if our paintings, some entities, they use the auction price, right, as a proxy for market price, so that might be, yeah, you can consider that, right? But even though some auction price, probably no one painting is the same, right? Yeah, and some may be priceless, like Mona Lisa, right? How could you put a value on the painting Mona Lisa, and people say it's priceless anyway. So consider the natures and use of the public heritage facilities. It means that it can be quite difficult. because they are not for sales, right? There is an absence of value in use and absence of value in exchange, and it involves externalities, right? Particularly if we consider there are external benefits, right, in terms of giving the community the enjoyments and also educational purposes. So if these kind of external benefits are not captured in the commercial approach of valuation, okay, right? So in that case, if there is external benefits, it means the valuations actually is understated, right? So the actual value might be greater than the values on paper, right? And if there is any negative externalities, right, any social costs against that is not incorporated into the valuations, and in that case, the valuation might be overstated. Okay. All right. Now, I'd like to show you an example before we move on. Let's see. Let's look at our Australian War Memorial. Have you been there? Have you been there? If you've been there, so you can see all these artifacts and historical military equipment, right? They're fascinating. So if you haven't been there, you can go and have a look at the items, right, in the War Memorial. I want to show you some pictures, but I don't. Yeah. Anyway, I think let's go to the financial statement maybe. Have a look. Hopefully, this is. Sorry, Sam, the page number that time doesn't really correspond to. So this is the balance sheet, right? So you can see the heritage and cultural facility here, right? And it is the major items of all the non-financial assets, right? So you can see that it's actually it's nearly how many? More than 80%, right, of the total non-financial assets. So it's quite significant for the War Memorial. So how did they come up with this value, right? So 1 billion, okay. So we can have a look at. So if we look at the accounting policy here, the cultural and heritage assets, so what do they include? So this gives you some ideas of what they include, right, in the War Memorial's valuations of the cultural assets. So the work of art, right, some of the technology objects, right, military technology items, and film, audios, etc. Right, so so there are quite a varieties of the items include. Right, so valuations, right, in terms of valuations, and they are carried at fair value, right, which is measured at depreciated replacement cost or market selling price, right, for item where a market exists. Okay, now. This is basically they're based on the accounting standards, right, requirement. So we already look at some of the argument about the difficulty in terms of valuing it, right? So it's quite interesting of how they get the fair value, right? How they get the market values, etc. Okay, and the depreciable replacement cost. So it says following initials are recognitions, right? Heritage and cultural assets that carry a fair value, less accumulate depreciations and impairments. Okay, valuations are conducted with sufficient frequency. Okay, so so they do not differ materially from assets fair values, right, from time to time. Okay, so it's the depreciated replacement cost. So what is the useful life of these types of assets that we look at here, right? So the depreciation rate, right, the useful life, right, for the memorial, right, it ranges from 500 to 600 years. Okay, so you can see how long, right, is the useful life of some of the cultural heritage facilities. Right? If it is 600 years, how useful the depreciation rate would be. Okay, so yeah, so you can see that might not be very useful. I think we probably now the fair value measurement. This is very blurred. I don't know why it's so blurred here. I want to show you how they really value put the fair value onto it, but but this is not very clear. It says you use it's based on identical. The significant unobservable inputs are used in the fair value measurements of memorials, heritage, and cultural assets are identical or similar items sold, right, through recorded auction sales, right? So some of the values they get it from auctions, auction sales, catalogs, and non-private collections. Okay, right. So this is the way that they get the value, right, for the war memorial items. Okay, so whether you are convinced with this value or not, right? So you can think about that. And again, as I said, is very debatable. So, do you think these values is really useful, right, for managing the war memorial collections? Now let's look at the purpose of war memorial. What do you think is the major missions and purpose of war memorial? Right, let's just go back to the page here. Okay. So if you look at the purpose here, right, so the purpose of Australian War Memorial, right, commemorates the sacrifice of those Australians who died in the war, right, or operational service. And the missions is to assist Australians to remember, interpret, and understand the Australian experience of war, okay, and its impacts on Australian society. Now, to achieve these missions or purpose, what information do you think Australian War Memorial will need, right, in order to manage the collections to achieve this purpose? Do you think the evaluations will be useful, right, for assessing this kind of achievement? Yeah, probably may or may not. Okay, so people are arguing probably not very useful. So if valuation is not very useful, what kind of information might be useful? Right. Now, the annual report provides quite a number of other information, right, the non-financial types of informations. Let's show you here. So if it goes on to look at the national collections, right? So you give a description of the major national collections, and how the war memorials manage these kind of collections. Right, so these informations might be helpful. Okay. All right. So if you look at other some performance indicators, right, provided in the annual report, talk about some the memorial buildings and grants conserved and developed, right, as a national memorial to Australian. So they are conserved, okay? They require maintenance and conservations, which is more important, right, than the valuations. And I think, yeah, these are similar, right? So the memorial heritage buildings, right, they're being maintained and presented to high standard, okay? Some of the area like this, right, access to memorial and visitors facilities, right, of the high standard, okay? Some of these are performance indicators that look at the conservations, right, and the standards of the collections, right, so it might be more relevant. Let's look at some of those. And another, like the number of new items acquired, okay? So yeah, you show some, what is new and how many new items are being acquired, right? So you have a list of the items, and that might be more useful, and the number of items disposed, okay? So you have ideas of the number of items being enhanced, okay, and the storage. Okay. All right. So I guess just show you some examples of some of other informations, right, that might be useful, right, in terms of the facilities. Okay. So let's come back to here. So for the information that is required for good management of public heritage facilities, so apart from the financial values, there's actually some other information that is useful, and it has to be related back to the reasons, right, for the provisions of these types of facilities, right? So it has to be in relation to the purpose, right, or the missions of the managing entities, okay? So therefore, some of the information like the physical state of the facilities, right, the maintenance requirements, conservation policy, which is quite important for these types of facilities, the range of collections, right, how many new items have been acquired, is there any plan for new acquisition, new collections, right? Any gaps in them, right? So visitors number, right, because the mission is to educate the communities, right, and evaluations, etc. Right? Okay. Some of the financial informations might be useful, right? Such as if there is any government revenues, right, from governments, operating costs, right? So which is necessary, and the liabilities if there is any. The maintenance and conservation costs, right, which might be included in the operating costs, which are quite important financial information as well. But the usefulness of the evaluations can be controversial, right? So apart from draw the manager's attention to the volumes of the facilities, right? So the actual use of the valuations might be very arguable. Okay, all right. Now, I found recently the ANAO's the Australian National Audit Office, it conduct an audit on the management of national collections, right? So it audits two entities, right? The Australian War Memorial and National Gallery of Australia, right? So what do they find, and why they do an audit, and what do they find? So if you look at the rationale, right, for undertaking the audit, right, so you can see they provide historical, right, academic and cultural values to people, okay? And therefore some effective collection management is quite important. And what does that mean by effective collection management? Right, so it includes the practical management, right, such as the care of the collections, how to handle them, and conserve or store them securely, and to account for them, right? And also on the governance side, right, such as the framework, right, for development of the collections, and the assets risk management, acquisition disposal process, okay, or any financial management control or any other internal control, okay. So these are all important area. So what do they find is that the Australian War Memorial has implemented some collection management practices which are effective, right? So maybe we just look at the War Memorial since we look at that, okay? And it also says something, it has effective governance and risk management framework, but its collection management require improvement, right? In terms of establishing a central and consistent storage, monitoring, review process. Right? So you talk about the collection management systems, and some areas that might require improvement, such as their collection development plan, which have been out of date, right, for 5 years, and they do not have a conservation plan in place, right, to identify and prioritize their conservation activities. Okay, so you can see conservations and the development plan, which are important, storage, etc. Right? So, and all these highlight that to effectively manage these types of assets, right? The entities would need to have effective internal control, right? And as well as putting in place and effective management systems as well. Okay, and all these would require both financials and non-financial informations, right, to manage the assets. Okay, right. Okay, let's come back to our lectures here. Right. So I guess we have a look at some of the controversial issues relating to these types of facilities. Now, if there is argument, say the evaluation is probably not quite useful. Right, and it's not very useful to put the assets on the financial statement. Is there an alternative solution? Right, Barton's articles actually suggests an alternative ways of accounting for these types of facilities. The suggestion is to treat these types of assets as trust assets. Okay, the managing the entity which manages these types of assets is. It play a role as trustees, okay? So the trustees manage the assets on behalf of the public, because all these facilities actually belong to the nations, right? And so the trustee manage it for the nations and on behalf of the public. And the trustees will maintain the heritage facilities for the benefits and preserve them for the benefits of the public and also for the benefits of future generations. Okay, and so the trust can be considered as a separate entity, right, from the trustee manager. Right. So if the asset is considered as a trust asset, that should be separated from the entity's other assets. Right. So in other words, they should be accounted for separately from the entity's other types of assets, right? So maybe another statement or separately identify these two types of assets, right? So if you read Barton's articles, right, so it's quite an interesting ideas about how to account for these types of facilities. All right. Let me go through the existing accounting requirement, right, for these types of facility. As we know, the in Australia, we adopt a sector-neutral approach. It means that the Australian accounting standard is applicable to both the private sector and the public sector. And therefore, the public sector and these types of facilities also need to be accounted for in accordance with the accounting standard. So one of the relevant accounting standards is AASB 116, property, plant and equipment. Many of you might be familiar with this accounting standard if you have done corporate accounting. It applies to both private firms as well as not-for-profit organizations. So in relation to not-for-profit organizations, it states that if an asset is acquired at no cost, right, or for a nominal cost, the cost is fair value as at the date of acquisition. It means that they have to be accounted for at fair value, right? And it says that the cost of an asset of property, plant, and equipment should be recognized as assets if and only if it is probable that future economic benefits associated with the item will flow to the entity, and the cost of the items can be measured reliably. Right? So we have already looked at the argument about these types of requirement, and so the major issues is about some reliabilities of measurement. Okay, and because of the issues about the reliabilities of measurement, the AASB 116 actually has a implementation guidance. So the implementation guidance recognizes this kind of difficulties in measuring heritage and cultural facilities. So it says heritage and cultural assets which are acquired at no cost. Depending on circumstances, it may not be possible to reliably measure the fair value. Okay, so if it is not possible to measure the fair value reliably, it means that the entity may not it may not be necessary for the entity to recognize it on the balance sheet. Okay. So cultural and heritage assets may not have limited useful life, right, and therefore may not be subject to depreciation. And again, for those that may not have a limited useful life, right, such as those that are subject to continuous preservations, right, and conservations, okay, and so they don't need to be depreciated, right? But on the other hand, the accounting standards also require that in that case, they should keep a record of all these conservations and preservations record. Okay. Right. So apart from the Australian accounting standards, right, there are some other guidelines not provided by the accounting standards, but by other bodies. Right, so in relation to museums, right, so museums, again, there are a lot of heritage, cultural and heritage items, right, and collections, and it's also very difficult to value them. So because of these kind of difficulties, the Australian museum sector, right, the councils of Australian museum directors, right, so the bodies for the Australian museum sectors, they issued a evaluation framework in 2018. Says that it provides guidance on the applications of Australian accounting standard requirement for valuations of museum collections. Right? Okay. Now this is not mandatory, but because of the difficulties in implementing the accounting standard requirements. So the council provides some guidance on how to implement, right, the Australian accounting standard requirement. So it's not a deviation from the accounting standards, right, but it's just a guidelines of how to do it. Okay. And so it also says the use of evaluation method depends on the types of collections, right? Whether observable market price exists or whether the value can be measured reliably. Okay, so the suggestion is to identify the types of collection So there might be different categories of collections, right? So one of the categories is those very highly sensitive collections, right? Those that are considered as priceless, right? And those without a market or conservable market, okay? Then in that case, those collections may not be recognized, right, or may not be measured. And there are some other categories, such as the rare photographs or artworks, etc. Right. So the fair values may be able to be estimated from the market, right, such as the auction price, etc. So in that case, that might be used, right, as a reference point. Okay. So so it's based on different types of collections, and for other general collections, maybe replacement costs might be used. Okay. In UK, the Financial Reporting Councils, it requires the recognition of heritage assets, right? But it allows these assets not to be recognized, right? If information about the cost or value is not available, right? So the UK Financial Reporting Council also recognized difficulties in terms of the measurement. Okay, but it also suggests that disclosures of non-financial information, including the nature and scales of heritage assets, policy for acquisition, preservations, management, and disposals, right? Some should be disclosed. Okay, so and it highlights that all these non-financial informations might be useful and they should be disclosed. Okay, all right. So overall we can see the the relevance of the evaluations of public heritage facilities can be quite controversial. Okay. And the key issue is the reliability of measurements, which is quite difficult to measure, right? And non-financial information can be useful, right, for managing these types of assets. Okay. All right. So we finished with the public heritage facilities. Let's take a break, and then we come back to look at the next topic. Right. So we have finished with the accounting for public sector assets, and now let's move on to another topic, the marketizations of public sector services. Okay. The readings, you can read chapter 4, just those page range, right? So you give you a background information about the marketizations, right, in Australia public sector. Now, the second article is related to commercial in confidence outsourcing contracts. Right? So the articles raise some issues about these types of contracts and the potential implications on transparencies and also the accountabilities. Okay? There are other references that you can refer to it. Okay. So for this topic, we look at what is marketizations, okay, and new public management. And then we'll look at two areas. One is the commercial practices adopted by government, and another area is the competitive tenderings and contracting. Okay. Now, I think at the start of the semester, I just sort of talked to her about some new public management. Okay, and so one of the aspects of new public management is marketizations. So what is meant by marketization? Right. So it's basically is the government use the private sector market approach for delivering the public sector services. Okay, all right. And as you say, it is related to new public management because the motivations of marketization comes from the ideas of new public sector management. So new public sector management is a reform widely adopted in Western nations in early 1990s. And so it's based on the ideas that governments are too large, okay, and it's inefficient. So one of the key aspects of the reform is to pursue efficiency, pursue government efficiencies, right? And it is believed that efficiency can be enhanced through the use of private sector market approach, right? So under that idea, the government introduced market competitions and other types of commercial practices. Right? So the idea is that the government should only focus on core government activities. Right? So any non-core government activities should be outsourced, right, or should be delivered by the market, right, and therefore they bring in private sectors providers to provide all these services that are considered as non-core. Okay, and the devolutions of decision-making authorities to the public sector manager also paved the way for all this kind of marketization as well. Okay, and of course, in this way, the governments aim to achieve a smaller state, right, smaller governments, right. So these are all the basic ideas of new public management, right, because they believe the government is too big. Okay, so back to 1996, the National Commissions of Audit have mentioned that over the last decade, the Commonwealth government has set in train a process to reappraise the provisions of services by one agency to other government agencies or to the public. Right? The objectives of the resulting commercialization of services has been to increase the efficient utilizations of resources and the effectiveness and transparency of service delivery. Right, so back to 1990s, that is the government belief, right? The government wants to achieve efficiencies and effectiveness, and they believe that the way to do it is to bring in market approach, right, with commercializations of public sector services. Okay. So the key features, right, of this process involves various aspects. So it involves the separations of regulatory and service delivery functions. Right? So once is separated, that means the governments can focus on the regulation, and the service delivery functions can be outsourced, right, to other private sector providers. The progressive introductions of contestable markets wherever appropriate and possible. Right, so once a contestable market is develops, then the private sector partners can be brought in. And increased use of contracting out where appropriate, and concentration on core or specialist service provisions. Right, so there are lots of contracting out, so we will look at that in a minute. User pays. So this is a user charging system, right? So even for government using other government services, they still charge other governments, right, for using that. So this is basically a commercial concept of charging the buyers. Okay. User choice, so provides more choice, right, to the users, right, through market competitions, and transfer of funds from suppliers to customers, or the purchasing agencies, right? So so in this way, it gives the customers more choice, right, for the services, and self-funding of service providers, right? So the service provider have to be self-funded, and also use full cost accrual accounting, right, to facilitate this process as well. Okay, so these are some of the key aspects, right? So we will look at some of these in a minute. As we mentioned just now, or at the start of the semesters, the new public management is based on public choice theories, right? So this theory is behind all these commercializations or marketization practices. So what is public choice theories? Right? I get a quote, right, from COVID-19 in a book. It says it's the applications of classical economic methods of analysis to political and administrative system, right? So it's still based on economic concepts, right? The economics assumptions. The object is to discover underlying patterns of behavior, okay? And then to prescribe policies which will increase the public's power to choose policies and serve their interests as consumers, right? So it's based on the economic theories and assumptions of utility maximizations, right? So I jump to this part, right? The self-seeking behavior, right? So it's based on the ideas that government entities, right, their self-interest, right? So the self-interest behavior dominates in government. So the departments or agencies, they might like to extend their influence, right, or try to pursue and increase their own budgets, etc. Right? So all these are self-seeking behavior, and so based on these assumptions, and they try to observe, right, or discover some of the patterns of behavior, and then use certain policies, right? And the policies is basically to increase the public's power to choose, right? So that means they give the consumers more choice, right? So that's why some competitions might be an approach to do that, right? So through market competition, you will enhance or give consumers more choice, okay? And so so it's a basis of marketizations, right? And it's based on the models of competitive market. Okay, and the purpose is to reduce the size of the governments, and also change the role of the governments, right? So the role of governments is just focus on the core activities, rather than all activities. So there are different forms of marketizations, such as the adoptions of commercial practices, competitive tendering, contracting, right? So that means outsource the government services, public-private partnerships, and privatizations. Now, today's topics will only focus on the first two. Next week, we will look at public-private partnerships, and in a later topic, we will look at the privatizations area, okay? Privatizations of government business enterprise. Okay. All right. So first of all, let's look at the commercial practices. So commercial practices is the adoptions of a commercial approach in delivering government services. Okay. There are various aspects of commercial practices. So one of the key areas is the use of commercial accrual accounting principles. As we mentioned previously, why the government use commercial accrual accounting principles. So one of the reasons is to facilitate the use of private sector partners. Okay, so it's a way of facilitating the market approach, and we know that there are various problems of the use of commercial accrual accounting principles for government area, right? So we look at those issues in the last few topics. Another aspect is the user charging service for services. Okay, so it's a user charging approach. Say, for example, it involves co-payment for use of government services. For example, the co-payment for use of health services, right? So pay for the ambulance or water charge, etc. Right, so they are all co-payments by the users. And for from the perspectives of government entities, right? So the government entities also charge other government entities for the use of their services. One of the purpose, right, is to involve full cost recovery. Right, so the use of full cost recovery. And so they charge the users, and so the purpose is to hold the governments accountable, right, or to hold the public sector managers accountable for the full cost of services, right? So you can see all these are related, right? So the use of market approach, and so they charge the users, right, or charge government entities, and they need to do that to be accountable for the full cost of services. Of course, to account for the full cost, they will need accrual accounting, right, in order to estimate the full cost. Okay, but of course, one of the issues about user charging is what should be the appropriate level of charge, right? How much they charge the customers or charge the other government entity using their services, etc. Okay, right. And also separating some policy formulation from service delivery. Right. So this is one of the aspects to open up contestable market. the policy formulation part normally is undertaken by government, all right, so government set the policy, formulate policies, and the service deliveries can be outsourced, right, to the private sector partners, right. So this is a ways of opening up some of the area for marketizations. Corporatizations and commercialization of government trading enterprises. Now, again, we will look at this area in later topics, right, when we look at government trading enterprise. So it's a way that the government tries to marketize the government trading enterprise, right, because they're government business, okay, they're considered as non-core government area, right, so they try to, marketize the area. Okay, so these are some of the areas of commercial practices, and I won't go into much details of that. So relating to the commercial practices is the use of competitive tenderings and contracting. Right? So basically, it's outsourcing the government services. Now, there has been increasing use of outsourcing, right, by the governments. And one of the principles of outsourcing or competitive tendering and contracting is the principles of competitive neutralities. So the argument is that governments are not really has a comparative advantage in providing government business, right, as compared to the private sector, right? So in order for the governments to compete with the private sector when they marketize, right, so the government have to introduce this competitive neutrality principle in order to encourage the fair competitions, right, in providing the government services, okay? So once the governments open up the market or bring in the private sector's competitors, it means that the government entities, right, particularly the government business entities, has to compete with the private sector competitors, right? So there is argument about whether they are really a level playing fields, right? Because the governments are subject to a lot of regulations, right, like Telstra, right, the telecommunications or water, electricity. They are subject to a lot of government regulations, so they may not be at a level playing field or may not have comparative advantage. Okay, and in order to be competitive with the market, full cost of services is necessary. Right, so it has to be it needs to account for the full cost of services. So costings can be an issue, right? Particularly when we use the commercial accrual accountings, and we're looking at the depreciation. It can be an issue, right, when we calculate the full cost of the services. Okay. Now let me give you some examples about the outsourcing. As I say, there has been a lot of outsourcing going on, right, in the public sectors. But they are not without problems, right? Actually, there are quite a lot of problems with outsourcing. Now, this article is 2015, right? So you talk about tens of thousands of Australian public service jobs being signed up for potential privatizations, right? And so they try to open up the market for the private sectors, and so the government try to reduce the public sector jobs and provide the jobs to the private sector. Okay. Now this back to earlier time, right? 2004, right? So there are a lot of outsourcing by Department of Defense, and the outsourcing bills a lot. Okay. And costs blow out, right, for outsourcing legal works. And a lot of government entity at that time, they outsource their IT services, they outsource the legal area, right? So the outsourcing bills, the costs just blow out. Is this one? That's good. So talking about the flaws of public contracting. This is back to a while ago, 2005. Now, this is Pat Barrick's, he is the former Auditor General, and is the Auditor General at that time. Pat will be one of the guest speaker for the public sector audit, right, in week 9. Okay, so yeah. So talking about the flaws of public contracting, and because all these outsourcing contracts require contract management, and actually some the government staff, right, public sector officials, they may not have that kind of expertise, right, in contract management. So it requires staff trainings, etc., right, in order to be able to manage the contract. Okay. Let's look at this one. And again, there is talking about a lot of the public services. At least a third of the public services, right, in these countries are delivered by private and not-for-profit providers, right, under a variety of different arrangements. And not all have been well designed. Many are not contestable, right? And even where competitive tendering has been employed, right, the public interest has not always been well served, right? So you can see some of the problem identified, right? The private sector entities may not really observe the public interest, okay, when they provide the services. Okay. And audit office, right, look into the air surface management, and with the outsourcing contracts, so I said there are conflict of interest discovered, right, by the audit office. Okay, and for this one, so again, more recent, right, 2015, the New South Wales is still cost blowout, and Medicare already outsourced, right? That was back to 2016, but it's already outsourced. This is very recent, right? Okay, 2018. Okay, last year, there has been issues about the contractor spending, right? There are so many outsourcing contracts, and the governments the cost of contracting has doubled and skyrocketed. And so there's similar issues, right, some relating to the outsourcings. And so I'll show you some, this is the ANAO report. It's not an audit report, right, but it's an information report that the auditors has conducted into the contract, right, the Australian government's contract report, okay? So just shows you the amount of contract and also the types of contract, right? You can see which one is the biggest. There are a number of contracts here, right, and the contract value. So can you see which departments has the most contract? Right, so this one, right, you can see Department of Defense, right, it has 123,000 contract, right, between the period, right, 2013 to 2016, right, between this, so it's a lot. Okay, so you can see the value is a lot, and they mainly relate to the acquisitions of defense equipment, actually. Okay, and there's a lot of problem with that, right? And other big items. Is there any other big items? So defense probably is the biggest. Immigrations, human services. Okay, Centrelink, a lot are outsourced, right, to private sectors, processing, etc. Okay, so what are the area, right, or what are the services that are being outsourced? So this is by value, right? So you can see the blue one is the biggest, right? So the blue one will be the commercials and military, private vehicles, the associates and components, right? So probably defense. Defense has a lot of military acquisitions, procurements, right, and which is built by private sector providers. The other big areas, right, so this one is the management and business professional and administrative services. Many of them might be related to consultancy services, okay? A lot of accounting firms, they provide consultancies, services to the government. It can be internal controls or just management, risk management, etc. Right? And other areas are information technology, right? Broadcasting, telecommunication, engineering, etc. Now, IT and legal works, there are other areas that is the biggest areas of outsourcing. Okay, let's look at some other interesting facts. Okay, so this shows you the private sector suppliers. So who are the biggest private sector suppliers? Are you familiar with these companies, right? So some of them, so you might be familiar with them, right? So IBM, Boeing, okay, Telstra, Hewlett Packard, okay. So all these are private sectors providers. If the government want to acquire certain assets or facilities, okay. ABE systems is also provides services to defense as well. Okay. And maybe I show you. So how about the accounting firm? Just now we say the accounting firm actually provide quite a lot of consultancy services, and the government agents, government department and agencies, they like to use the big four accounting firms. Okay, so you can see here. Most of the contract are given to the big four accounting firm. Okay, so there has been some controversial issues about there are too many outsourcing providers to the big accounting firm. Okay. All right. So we have some ideas about the scope, right? The level of outsourcing, and some of them actually have a lot of problems, particularly cost blowout, right, or delays in providing the services, etc. Okay. And another issue is for the government is how to actually effectively manage the contract, right? So once there are so many outsourcings, the government have to manage the contract. But many public sector servants, they may not have that kind of skills or expertise in managing the contract, right? And they also have to consult the legal firm, right? So actually, apart from accounting firm, right, legal firm is another biggest providers of government service because the government have to consult them. Okay. So some of the area that has been suggested that we need to pay attention to, right, in terms of contract management. Includes project planning and control, because very often the contracts are quite complex, right? Complexities of the government services, so they require careful planning and control. Corporate knowledge and capacity. So once services are outsourced, there is a risk that there will be a loss of corporate memory, right? The corporate knowledge or capacities might be reduced. Okay, so there is a need to consider how to maintain the corporate knowledge and capacity when services are outsourced. A long-term approach, and again, outsourcing normally focus on short-term cost savings, right? And so the government department actually have to consider the long-term effects, right? And so they have to look at the long-term approach, right? While the contract, they are more short-term focus. Okay, so they have to balance the short-term focus and the long-term approach of government services, and particularly with staff training and also succession plans, etc. Right. So related to that is the competence of in-house staff on negotiating managing some of the contracts, right? So there's quite a number of issues relating to the capabilities of the government agencies. Okay. And ANAO in 2012 is also identifies some factors, right, for effective contract management. So the first one is managing risk, right? So managing risk is quite important, right, in terms of identifying the risk and also mitigating the risk. So what kind of risk might be involved in contract? Show you some example in this one. So these are some of the examples in the ANU Better Practice Guide, right? Resourcing, right? The risk relates to resourcing such as inability to obtain or retain necessary level of resources, right? Including specialist advice or failure to obtain senior management support, right? So another risk relates to contract delivery, such as inability to obtain stakeholder or end user input or sign off for contract deliveries, etc. Contract performance measurement is very important. So some of the risks may relate to the failure to specify performance indicators, right, that can be cost effectively measured, or failure to link contract payment to satisfactory performance. So this is really a very huge risk for the government, right? Because the government have to consider the qualities of services, right? And so and have to link the contract payment to satisfactory performance. And the contract payments, whether there's any failure to cap contract expenditure, right, or failure to establish payment milestones, etc. Right. So these are some of the risks in contract management. Okay. Right. So other areas is managing the relationship. So it's important to maintain a productive relationship with the private sector partner, and it's quite important to maintain open and productive communications, right, with private sector partner. So in case there is any problems or issues arise, so those issues can be dealt with in a more timely manner. Managing the resources. So the resources is not only include financial resources, but also some human resources as well. As we mentioned just now, some capabilities, right, is quite important as well. Specifying the responsibility, so it's necessary to establish a clear lines of responsibility and accountability for all the decision makings. I say whether there is appropriate steps, right, for authorizations and delegations, etc. Right, any payment to the contractors, right, has to be valid. Right, so there must be a process and systems in place. Keeping records, right, is also important. So there must be systems of record keeping, right, to keep all the transactions and documentation of the service delivery and the contract. And this is for accountability and transparency purpose. Okay. Behaving ethically against this is important so as to avoid any potential conflicts of interest or misappropriations of resources. Okay. All right. So this is in summary, right, some of the key points about some competitive tenderings and contractings. So there might be a course of monitoring and assessing the performance of the private sector partners. So it's quite important to monitor the performance of private sector partner and how to effectively monitor the performance, right? So it's an important issues, right? And what are the performance indicators, etc. Risk management, we mentioned about that just now, because of the complexity of tasks, right? And it also relies on the private sector to provide the services. So managing risk is important so as to avoid any potential cost blowout. So that is a financial risk, right? Or any potential legal issues, right? So if the contract is not properly managed, there might be some legal issues, or the private contractor might sue the government. Okay. Efficiency gains. So is there any efficiency gain through outsourcing? Right. So this is arguable. Right. The purpose of outsourcing is to obtain efficiency gains through cost saving. Right. So normally, there will be gains, right, if the work can be improved, right? The performance, right, of the work can be improved, right? And so there might be efficiency, there might be gain. But if the efficiency is obtained as a result of some other cost reduction, for example, the use of temporary staff, right? There might be some issues later on, or in the long term, there might be some issue. There might be cost blowout in future, right, to rectify any shortfalls or shortcomings. Okay. There may be a potential decline in quality of services, right? So it's quite likely that there might be a trade-off between quality of services and also the cost. Because private sector providers, they do not normally willing to perform the level of services above any minimum requirement. Okay. So that the most important issue is the accountability issues. Right. One of the accountability issues involve the commercial in confidence contractings. And many contracts, they are written in commercial in confidence, and that means it make use of the confidentiality provisions in contract. And with all these commercial confidentiality provisions, it means that some of the provisions, right, or some of the aspects of the contract or the service provisions might be kept secret, right, and not the information is not provided to the public. Okay, so that raises the issues about is it possible to maintain accountabilities, right, with commercial in confidence contracts, right? With the private sector partners, there might be some area that is generally commercially confidential, right? There might be some sensitive information that has to be kept confidential and not to be disclosed, right? But other than some of the genuine one, would that this kind of provisions be abused, and would it affect the accountability, right? So there are some issues relating to the commercial in confidence contracting. Give you some examples in the newspaper articles. Here, this one, back to 2003. Now, this is not a new issue, right? It's a commercial in confidence contract, and the problems about some secrecy of using this kind of contract, right, is not a new issue, right? It's happened since this kind of contracts are in place. Okay, so details of government contracts are kept secret, right? So the another newspaper articles, right, about the public contract is not policed, right? So it's talking about all these contracts, and even though the NAO conducts some audit into the contracts, right, the contract management, some of the areas are not really enforced, okay, because ANAOs only conduct the audit, but they do not have an enforcement role, right? So they're concerned about whether the commercial in confidence are appropriately apply, okay? So the auditors, they attack any non-disclosure, right? And okay, so just give you some examples of the issues about commercial in confidence contracting. Now, because of the concern about the secrecies, that might reduce the parliamentary scrutinies. Now, previously, there has been a number of JCPAA inquiries and also the ANAO audit report, right, that highlights the government contract problems, right? They found a number of ANAO report. They found that only a small proportions of the government contract generally they contain the genuine commercial confidentiality informations, right? So that means most of the contracts they may not be properly applied and results in secrecies. Okay, and to address these issues, the Senate issues a Senate order, right, in 2001, Okay, and it required the departments to publish on the internet, right, a list of all the contracts that worth 100,000 or more, right? So this way, some idea is to limit the secrecies and provide some kind of transparency. Okay, apart from some the contract names, right? They also need to provide some certain information about some various areas of the contract, right? So apart from the contractor, who are the contractors? They have to provide the amount, right? The subject matters and the durations of the contracts, and also say statements of the reasons for including the confidentiality provisions as well. Okay, so the purpose is to limit the inappropriate use of the confidentiality provisions. And the Senate also required the auditor to undertake audit of the contract, right, as a kind of reviews of the contractings. Now, I'll show you some of the findings of the ANAO audit of the contract. Now this one is back to 2009 and 10 audit, right? So it looked at the agency's proportions of contract, right, reported as containing confidentiality provisions. Okay, so there seems to be decline, right, in the use of confidentiality provisions over time. And this one, you look at the summaries of the contracts, right, with confidentiality provisions. Now let's look at the last column here, right? The last column, can you see that? Contract containing correct confidentiality provisions and correctly listed on the website. Okay, so how many percentage of the contract audited correctly contain the correct confidentiality provisions and correctly listed? Only 20%. It means that another 80% has problems. Okay, so that was back to 2019. Okay, maybe I skip this part. So over time, some ANAOs continue to conduct audit, right, of the Senate order. And so this is a trend. Now, just now, so we look at 2018, right? So there are about 20%, right, of the contract contain confidentiality provisions. But over time, you can see the contract that contain confidentiality provision has declined actually, right, because of all this monitoring, right, and the requirements to provide information on the websites, right. So a way to limit the secrecies and also enhance the transparency. So there is a decline, right, in the use. So what are these confidentiality provisions? So what types of information can be considered as genuinely confidential? Okay, like the pricing informations, right? Industrial process formulas, etc. Right? This is also taken from the ANA report. So it's classified into specific, right? And general confidential agreement requirement in contract. So these are the specific items, right? Like the price discount informations, okay, specific contract informations relating to statutory secrecy provisions and security arrangements, etc. So these are specific general confidential information, right? Okay, so and also proprietary methodology process, etc. So there are other general, these are also general, right, confidentiality information, confidential information like all information, common material, policy, instructions, etc. Okay. So the audit, right, look at the trend in the appropriate use of the confidential provisions. So you can see the ANO undertake audits every year, right? So because this is a huge issue, right? So it's important issue, so important to make sure that the provision is properly applied and there is transparency. Okay, so what are we looking at here? Now, I'd like to look at this one. What percentage of the audited contract contains specific confidentiality provisions that met the confidentiality test, right? So the ANAO has certain confidentiality tests, and how many percentage actually met the test, and which therefore means that they contain genuine confidential information and is listed properly, okay, or report in a proper way. So over time, the percentage, that which is the last column here, the bottom column here. Now over time, the percentage is very, very low, right? So 13, 20, 2015 is higher, right? 2016, 17 is only 14%. Okay, correct. Okay, talk to you about this later. All right, so let's go back to our slides here. Okay. So you can see over time, there are still issues identified by ANAO. So this is 2019. So ANAO states that incorrectly including confidentiality provisions or incorrectly listing contract as containing confidentiality provision potentially preclude or restrict the Parliament and the public from accessing information about these contracts. Okay, so is an accountability issues, right? So it restricts or weakens the accountability to the Parliament, right, or parliamentary oversight. Okay, and also weaken accountability to the public. Okay, so ANAO audit report, right? It reviews some sample of 95 contracts across 4 agencies. And they see a decline in the use of confidentiality provisions over time. Okay, however, right, the applications and reporting of confidentiality provisions is still problematic. Fewer than 40% of the contract examined report the confidentiality provision correctly. Okay, now this problem, right, similar problem was found in later report, right? Even the most recent one, right, 2017, they still found only 14% report confidentiality provision correctly, right? So there's still problem in terms of reporting the provisions. Okay, so so there is a implications for transparencies and also accountabilities. The Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act, right, is actually put responsibility on the entities, accountable authorities. Accountable authorities, they will refer to the head of departments or an executive board. Okay, so they have a responsibility to ensure the accuracies of the data, right? So that means applying to the confidentiality provision, the accountable authorities would have a responsibility to ensure that any listings or reportings of confidentiality contract is correct. Okay. A Senate inquiry in 2014, it recommended the annual audit report to be phased out and to be replaced by annual reports. So after so many years of audit by ANAO, right, so a Senate inquiry is considered that that's also identifying the problems, and there's a decline in the use of confidentiality clause, and so they recommend the phase out of the annual audit report. But in order to maintain accountability, right, and also monitoring, continue to monitor this kind of contracts, right, so they suggest that a biennial, right, every 2 years report is still necessary. Okay, so all these they have implications on transparency side. So without the annual audit, would it weakens the transparency, right? Or the or the 2 years audit is enough, okay, for the